A millionaire flaunted his mistress at a charity gala, leaving his wife behind. What happened at the event made him instantly regret it. The night had barely begun, but the air already carried the promise of luxury and hidden agendas. The sprawling Callaway estate, an architectural marvel with sleek marble columns and a manicured garden that stretched into the horizon, was unusually quiet. The silence was only broken by the faint clicking of Evelyn Callaway's heels as she walked through the grand hallway. The scent of freshly polished wood mixed with faint notes of jasmine perfume trailed behind her. Everything about the home spoke of wealth, yet something was missing: warmth. Evelyn paused near the window, her eyes drawn to the soft glow of the setting sun casting golden hues across the manicured lawn. Her silk dress, a delicate blend of ivory and gold, hugged her figure, but it wasn't her beauty that drew attention. It was her grace, the kind of quiet elegance that made people turn twice and wonder what thoughts she kept locked away. She clutched the charity gala invitation in her hand, fingers tightening over its embossed lettering as if it could tell her what to do next. Her gaze shifted toward the mahogany double doors of her husband's office. Ethan Callaway, her husband, the man who had once held her hand on rainy nights and shared dreams of building a future together, now existed like a phantom in her life. Physically present, but emotionally absent. They hadn't had a proper conversation in weeks, and tonight would be no different. But Evelyn was nothing if not determined. She adjusted her posture, lifted her chin, and made her way to the office, where she knew Ethan would be, buried under spreadsheets and phone calls, planning his next corporate takeover. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear the deep rumble of his voice. She knocked lightly. "Come in," he said without looking up, his voice commanding and distracted. Evelyn stepped inside and stood by the doorway for a moment, observing him. Ethan was in his early 40s, but carried himself like a man who thought time was his servant. His tailored suit fit him like a second skin, and his watch, one of those limited edition pieces that cost more than most people's annual salaries, gleamed under the soft light of the room. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his piercing blue eyes, once warm when they looked at her, were now calculating as they scanned the papers before him. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft but steady. He looked up briefly, then returned to his work. "What is it, Evelyn?" She held out the invitation. "The charity gala is tonight. I thought it would be nice if we went together." Ethan leaned back in his chair, finally giving her his full attention. But there was no warmth in his gaze, only irritation. "I can't. I have a business dinner with some clients." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. She had expected this, but that didn't make it hurt any less. "It's important to me, Ethan. It's for the Children's Education Fund. You know how much work I've put into this." "I know," he replied, but his tone was dismissive, as if her contributions were nothing more than a side project. "But this dinner is critical for closing a deal. You can go without me." A lump formed in her throat, but she refused to let him see how deeply his indifference cut her. "Of course," she said, her voice perfectly controlled. She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, Ethan spoke again, this time with a softer tone, though it was more out of obligation than sincerity. "I'll donate a significant amount on our behalf. People will notice, don't worry." Evelyn paused for a moment, then nodded without turning around. "I'm sure they will." Once outside, she allowed herself a deep breath. The ache in her chest was familiar now, a constant reminder of the man Ethan had become. The man who had once made her feel like the center of his world now treated her like an afterthought. But tonight, she decided, things would be different. She wouldn't cry in the confines of their empty mansion or drown herself in memories of what they used to be. No, tonight, she would reclaim her dignity. In a high-rise penthouse across the city, Delilah Chase adjusted her ruby-red gown in front of the mirror. She was the kind of woman who turned heads wherever she went. Long legs, striking features, and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She knew her power and had no shame in using it. She had spent months weaving herself into Ethan Callaway's life, playing the perfect role. Supportive, seductive, and free of the emotional demands that came with being a wife. Ethan arrived at her door precisely on time, his expression smug as he handed her a glass of wine. "You look stunning," he said, his eyes scanning her figure appreciatively. Delilah smirked. "And you look like a man who's about to have a good time. Let's make tonight memorable," he replied, taking her hand as they stepped into the private elevator. Back at the Calloway mansion, Evelyn stood in front of her bedroom mirror, fastening the delicate diamond necklace around her neck. Her reflection stared back at her, but she barely recognized the woman in the glass. Where was the fire she once had, the spark that made her believe she could conquer anything? She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "It's still there. You just have to find it." The sound of the chauffeur pulling up outside signaled that it was time to leave. She grabbed her clutch and made her way to the car, her resolve growing stronger with every step. The ballroom of the five-star hotel was a spectacle of opulence. Crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, and classical music that filled the air like a soft lullaby. Wealthy donors mingled, exchanging pleasantries and veiled boasts about their latest achievements. As Evelyn entered, heads turned, not because of her beauty, though she was undeniably striking, but because of the grace and composure she exuded. She spotted Ethan across the room, his arm wrapped around Delilah's waist as they laughed with a group of executives. For a brief moment, jealousy flared within her, but she quickly pushed it aside. Tonight wasn't about him. It was about reclaiming her identity, her dignity. A waiter approached with a tray of champagne, but Evelyn waved him off. She had no intention of drowning her frustrations in alcohol. Instead, she focused on the mission she had planned meticulously. She smiled politely at a group of philanthropists and struck up a conversation about the importance of education funding. Her passion for the cause was genuine, and within minutes, they were captivated by her knowledge and dedication. As the night went on, she made her way through the crowd, leaving an impression on everyone she met. But the highlight of her evening wasn't the conversations or the admiring glances. It was the discreet meeting she had arranged with the event organizer, where she finalized her bid on a significant donation, one that would change the course of the evening. Evelyn stepped back into the crowd, her heart racing not with fear but with anticipation. She was done being invisible. Tonight, she would remind everyone, including Ethan, of the woman she truly was. Before we continue, let me ask you something. What would you have done if you were in Evelyn's shoes? Would you have handled things differently or stayed as calm as she did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And hey, if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more drama ahead. You won't want to miss it. The ballroom of the Regency Grand Hotel was a masterpiece of extravagance, an opulent cathedral of wealth where the city's elite gathered to parade their riches disguised as philanthropy. Velvet drapes cascaded down the towering walls, and the glimmer of crystal chandeliers reflected off marble floors, casting shimmering patterns on the gowns and tuxedos that filled the room. Conversations floated through the air, punctuated by the clink of champagne flutes and bursts of laughter. It was the kind of place where reputations were made or ruined with a well-timed whisper. Ethan Calloway entered the ballroom with the confidence of a man who believed the world was his stage. Dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, he looked every bit the powerful executive whose mere presence commanded respect. But tonight, he wasn't alone. Delilah Chase, draped in a crimson gown that hugged her curves and sparkled under the lights, clung to his arm. Her red lips curved into a smile as she scanned the room, taking in the stares that followed them. "You like the attention," Ethan murmured, his lips close to her ear. Delilah smirked and tilted her head slightly to brush her cheek against his. Only when it comes with benefits. They moved through the crowd like royalty, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with business leaders, socialites, and politicians. To the onlookers, they were the epitome of sophistication. But beneath the surface, their relationship was as transactional as any business deal Ethan had ever made. Delilah was here for the lifestyle, the luxury, and the thrill of being seen on the arm of a man who could buy her anything she desired. Ethan, in turn, enjoyed the ego boost she provided, a sharp contrast to the stability of his wife, Evelyn, who had long ceased to excite him. At that moment, Evelyn Calloway arrived at the entrance of the ballroom, stepping out of the sleek black car with a grace that belied the turmoil brewing inside her. Her ivory gown flowed around her like liquid silk, and the simple diamond earrings she wore sparkled under the entrance lights. As the doorman opened the grand doors, she inhaled deeply, steadying herself. This wasn't just a charity event for her. It was a battlefield, and she had come prepared. Her eyes swept across the crowd, searching for a familiar face. She spotted him near the champagne fountain, laughing with Delilah and a small group of wealthy investors. For a moment, her heart clenched, but she quickly composed herself. Tonight, Ethan Callaway's presence, or absence, would not define her. The auction portion of the evening was about to begin, and the crowd gravitated toward the front of the ballroom, where a stage adorned with gold curtains and spotlights awaited. A charismatic auctioneer took the microphone, his voice cutting through the chatter as he introduced the evening's first item, an exclusive painting by a renowned contemporary artist. Bidding was competitive from the start, with paddle after paddle shooting into the air as eager socialites vied for the prize. Ethan, standing near the edge of the crowd with Delilah, raised his paddle lazily, offering a bid higher than anyone expected. Delilah giggled and whispered something into his ear, prompting him to smirk. He didn't care much about the painting, but the attention he garnered for making bold bids fed his ego. Evelyn, standing on the opposite side of the room, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of pity and resolve. She hadn't come to outbid anyone tonight, but that didn't mean she wouldn't leave an impression. As the auction progressed, she moved quietly, mingling with key donors and board members, ensuring that her presence was felt without being ostentatious. The room erupted in applause as the final gavel struck on a diamond necklace auctioned off for an exorbitant sum. Ethan leaned over to Delilah, brushing her shoulder with his fingertips. "Ready for the after-party?" he whispered, though his eyes were already scanning the room for familiar faces he could impress before leaving. "Always," Delilah replied, flashing him a coy smile. Meanwhile, Evelyn had slipped into a private room near the back of the ballroom, where a small group of event organizers gathered to process the evening's donations. She handed over an envelope containing her contribution, a sum so generous it made the room fall silent. The organizer, a man in his 60s with a kind smile, shook her hand firmly. "Mrs. Callaway," he said, his voice full of genuine admiration, "this is remarkable. Your donation will change lives." Evelyn smiled softly, but didn't linger to bask in the praise. "That's what I'm hoping for," she replied before turning back toward the ballroom. She knew that when the donation was announced later that evening, it would send shockwaves through the room, especially in Ethan's direction. The evening continued with a lavish dinner served under the soft glow of candlelight. Guests dined on gourmet courses, while musicians played a symphony in the background. Ethan found himself increasingly bored, checking his watch and sipping from his glass of bourbon. Delilah's flirtatious banter had lost its charm, and the conversations around him felt like white noise. He glanced toward the entrance, half expecting Evelyn to walk in and confront him, but the thought quickly faded as he convinced himself that she wouldn't dare. Little did he know, Evelyn was already there, quietly working the room and weaving her way into conversations that truly mattered. She didn't need to be on his arm to be noticed. Her presence alone was enough. Toward the end of the night, the event organizer stepped onto the stage, tapping the microphone to get the crowd's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice warm and inviting. "Tonight, we've witnessed extraordinary generosity. I'd like to take a moment to recognize the individual who made the largest donation of the evening." The room fell silent, and a ripple of anticipation spread through the crowd. Ethan leaned back in his chair, a smug grin playing on his lips. He fully expected his name to be called, having made a significant donation earlier through his company. Delilah touched his arm, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Please join me in thanking Mrs. Evelyn Callaway for her generous contribution, which will fully fund our new children's education initiative." The applause was deafening, but Ethan felt as though the floor had dropped beneath him. His eyes widened in shock as he turned to face the stage, where Evelyn stood gracefully, accepting the applause with a composed smile. Delilah shifted uncomfortably beside him, her fingers twitching as she realized the implications of what had just happened. Ethan's mind raced, trying to piece together how he had misjudged the situation so badly. He had dismissed Evelyn as irrelevant, assuming she would fade into the background while he flaunted his new relationship. But here she was, commanding the room without uttering a word to him. As the applause continued, Evelyn met Ethan's gaze across the room. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held a silent message. You can ignore me, but you'll never silence me. When the applause finally subsided, Evelyn returned to her table, surrounded by donors and influential figures who were eager to speak with her. Ethan, meanwhile, sat frozen, his thoughts spiraling. The night had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated, and for the first time, he felt the sting of defeat. Not in business, but in his personal life. Delilah leaned toward him, her voice a whisper. "Ethan, are you okay?" He didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on Evelyn, who had just turned the tides of the evening with the grace of a queen reclaiming her throne. He realized too late that she was no longer the woman waiting for him at home. She was a force of her own. The morning light filtered through the grand floor-to-ceiling windows of the Calloway mansion, casting soft golden rays on the marble floor. The events of the previous night played on a loop in Evelyn Calloway's mind as she stirred her tea at the long dining table, though she wasn't particularly in the mood for breakfast. Her hands moved mechanically, dipping the spoon in slow circles as if it could calm the storm inside her. The applause, the looks of admiration, and most importantly, the stunned expression on Ethan's face. It had been everything she'd hoped for. But satisfaction wasn't quite the word for what she felt now. There was a heaviness that came with reclaiming her place, as if she'd crossed an invisible line and couldn't return to the comfort of her old life, even if she wanted to. Her phone buzzed gently on the table, interrupting her thoughts. A message from one of the event organizers thanked her once again for her generous donation and invited her to a meeting next week to discuss future initiatives. Evelyn allowed herself a small smile before setting the phone down. She was no longer in the background, and people were noticing. Just then, the familiar sound of Ethan's footsteps echoed down the hall. She straightened her posture, preparing herself. The door to the dining room opened, and there he stood, dressed in his usual tailored suit, his tie slightly askew, as if he hadn't slept well. His gaze landed on her, unreadable but tense. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady as she took a sip of her tea. Ethan walked over to the coffee station and poured himself a cup. His movements were controlled, but Evelyn could see the small signs of agitation in the way his fingers gripped the cup too tightly and the way he avoided looking at her directly. "I suppose congratulations are in order," he said finally, his voice neutral but layered with something darker. "For the donation or the standing ovation?" Evelyn asked, setting her cup down delicately. He turned to face her, leaning against the counter. "You planned that, didn't you?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "You're surprised I did something meaningful without consulting you?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Evelyn stood up slowly, her chair scraping lightly against the floor as she pushed it back. She walked over to the large window, gazing out at the garden where the morning dew still clung to the grass. "You didn't think I could surprise you. That's the real issue, isn't it, Ethan? You've grown so comfortable underestimating me." He remained silent for a moment, the tension in the air palpable. "Why now?" he asked, his voice softer but still guarded. "Why make a move like this now?" Evelyn turned to face him, crossing her arms. "Because I'm tired of waiting for you to see me." Her words hung between them like a challenge. For a moment, Ethan considered defending himself, claiming that their relationship wasn't as broken as she made it seem. But the memory of last night silenced him. He had ignored her for months, taken her patience for granted, and flaunted his affair in plain sight. How could he deny what was in front of him? He took a step closer, his expression softening. "Evelyn, it doesn't have to be like this. We don't have to turn this into a war." "A war?" She let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Ethan, I'm not fighting you. I'm simply choosing not to fade into the background anymore." Her honesty disarmed him, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Guilt. But it wasn't enough to bridge the growing chasm between them. Later that afternoon, Evelyn sat in her study, surrounded by papers, notebooks, and files related to the charity projects she had taken on over the years. Most of them had been funded through private donations, or her personal savings because she had never wanted to involve Ethan. But now, with her public donation from the gala, she had gained new allies and resources. A knock on the door broke her concentration, and a familiar face peeked in. It was Caroline, her best friend and confidant. The two had met in college and had been inseparable ever since, sharing secrets and supporting each other through life's ups and downs. "I heard about last night," Caroline said as she entered the room, her smile warm and genuine. "Everyone's talking about it." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, exhaling. "Let me guess, half the people think I'm a saint, and the other half think I'm making a power grab." Caroline chuckled, pulling up a chair. "Does it matter what they think? You did what you needed to do." Evelyn rested her elbows on the desk, her fingers lacing together. "It's not about what they think, it's about Ethan. He looked different last night, like I caught him off guard." "Good," Caroline said firmly. "He deserves to feel off balance after everything he's put you through." Evelyn nodded, but remained thoughtful. "Do you think I went too far?" Caroline shook her head. "No, I think you finally went far enough. Don't second-guess yourself now. You've been patient long enough." As her friend's words sank in, Evelyn felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about proving a point to Ethan. It was about reclaiming her life and finding fulfillment beyond their fractured marriage. That evening, Ethan sat in his office, a glass of whiskey in hand as he stared out at the city skyline. The hum of traffic below was distant, almost like a forgotten memory, drowned out by the turmoil in his mind. He couldn't stop replaying the moment when Evelyn's name was announced at the gala, the pride in her eyes, and the way the crowd had embraced her. He had spent years believing that his success defined them as a couple, that as long as he provided financial security and social status, Evelyn would be content. But he had been wrong. He hadn't just ignored her. He had underestimated her strength and intelligence. The knock on the door was faint, but Ethan heard it. Delilah stepped inside, her presence unexpected. She wore a silk robe that hinted at an invitation, but tonight, Ethan wasn't interested. "I thought I'd stop by and see if you needed some company," she said, her voice playful as she approached him. Ethan set his glass down and ran a hand through his hair. "Not tonight, Delilah." Her playful expression faltered, replaced by confusion. "What's wrong?" He sighed. "Everything, it seems." Delilah's gaze hardened slightly. "Is this about Evelyn?" When he didn't answer, she took a step back, her posture defensive. "You're really letting her get under your skin, aren't you?" Ethan stood and walked past her toward the window, avoiding her gaze. "I think she's always been under my skin. I just never realized it until now." Delilah scoffed, her tone dripping with disdain. "You're chasing a woman who's already moved on, Ethan. Don't expect her to wait for you." Without another word, Delilah left, closing the door behind her with a sharp click. Ethan remained by the window, his reflection staring back at him like a ghost. Delilah's words echoed in his mind, but it wasn't her warning that stuck with him. It was Evelyn's voice from that morning. "You've grown so comfortable underestimating me." For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't sure what his next move should be. The echoes of last night's applause still resonated in the corners of the Regency Grand's ballroom, even though the space now lay empty, waiting for the next grand event. But the ripples of what had happened there were far from fading. Socialites, CEOs, and reporters whispered over morning coffees and afternoon lunches, dissecting the unexpected twist that had made Evelyn Calloway the name on everyone's lips. Evelyn, meanwhile, was back at her home office, organizing documents and answering emails. The sunlight streaming through the window warmed her face, but her mind was fixed on more practical matters. The gala had been a success beyond her expectations. The donation would not only secure funding for hundreds of underprivileged children, but it had also reminded people, especially Ethan, that she wasn't a forgotten figure. Her phone vibrated on the desk. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from the head of the charity foundation. "Thank you again for your extraordinary support. The board is excited to have you involved in future projects." She smiled and set the phone down, but her sense of triumph was short-lived. There was always something lingering when it came to Ethan, an unresolved tension that seemed to stretch further with each passing day. The house, despite its grandeur, had become a battlefield of silences and cold glances. And Evelyn knew that when Ethan finally decided to speak, it wouldn't be to congratulate her. She didn't have to wait long. By late afternoon, the soft hum of an approaching car drifted through the open window. She heard the front door open and close, followed by the familiar sound of Ethan's footsteps. He didn't immediately come to see her, which meant he was gathering himself, likely nursing the bruises to his ego. When he did enter her office, she noticed the way he stood in the doorway for a moment, as if gauging her mood. His tie was loosened and the top button of his shirt undone. Signs that he wasn't here to make a business pitch, but to confront her on a more personal level. "You've certainly made yourself the talk of the town," Ethan said, stepping inside and leaning casually against the doorframe, though his tone betrayed his irritation. Evelyn set down her pen and folded her hands neatly in front of her. "Good. It's about time." He chuckled, but it wasn't a warm laugh. "You planned that perfectly, didn't you? You knew exactly how to make sure everyone was talking about you by morning." "I planned the donation," she replied calmly. "The rest is just a natural consequence of doing something meaningful." Ethan walked closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't find it convenient that your sudden public generosity happened the same night I brought Delilah to the gala?" Evelyn didn't flinch. "And whose fault is that, Ethan? You brought her, knowing it would cause a stir. Don't blame me for stealing the spotlight when you handed me the opportunity." He paced toward the window, running a hand through his hair as he tried to control his frustration. "What are you trying to prove, Evelyn?" "Nothing," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not trying to prove anything to you. I'm proving something to myself." Her words hit harder than he expected. He turned to face her, his hands resting on his hips. "So, what now? Are we supposed to keep playing this game until one of us gives up?" Evelyn stood, smoothing the fabric of her dress as she walked past him to the window, where she looked out over the garden. "There's no game, Ethan. I'm not interested in competing with you or Delilah. But if you think I'll disappear quietly while you parade her around town, you're mistaken." Her gaze remained on the garden, but she could feel him watching her, weighing her words. For once, she didn't feel the need to fill the silence with explanations or apologies. She had spoken her truth, and now it was his turn to process it. The evening arrived with the same tension that had hung between them all day. Ethan retreated to his office, where he poured himself a glass of bourbon and sank into the leather chair behind his desk. The familiar warmth of the drink did little to ease the cold knot in his stomach. His mind replayed the scene from last night. The way Evelyn had commanded the room, the way Delilah had shifted uncomfortably beside him, and the way the crowd had turned their admiration toward his wife. The knock on his door startled him. For a brief moment, he thought it might be Evelyn, but when the door opened, it was Delilah. "Are you hiding in here?" she teased, stepping inside with a glass of wine in hand. Her movements were fluid and deliberate, like a cat circling prey. "I figured you'd need some company after last night." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He watched her as she leaned against the edge of the desk, her red lips curling into a smile that usually ignited something in him. But tonight, he felt nothing. "Last night didn't exactly go as planned," Delilah continued, her fingers tracing the edge of the desk. "Your wife certainly knows how to steal the spotlight." Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Don't remind me." Delilah tilted her head, studying him. "You're not seriously letting this get to you, are you? You've always been the one in control, Ethan. Don't tell me Evelyn's sudden power play has you questioning that." He looked at her, and for the first time, her words irritated him. Delilah had always been fun, a distraction from the responsibilities of marriage. But now, her presence felt like a reminder of his mistakes, of how he had allowed things to spiral so far out of control. "I'm tired, Delilah," he said, his voice void of its usual charm. "I think you should go." Her smile faltered. "Go? You heard me." He stood, signaling that the conversation was over. Whatever it was, it's done." Delilah's eyes flashed with anger, but she quickly masked it with a cold smile. I guess Evelyn's little act worked better than she expected. She grabbed her purse and walked out, leaving the scent of her perfume lingering in the air. Ethan exhaled and ran his hands through his hair. For years, he had prided himself on being the man who could manage everything. his business, his marriage, his public image. But now, all of it felt like sand slipping through his fingers. The next morning, Evelyn sat in the garden with a cup of tea, enjoying the cool breeze and the scent of blooming roses. She heard the sound of Ethan's footsteps on the gravel path and wasn't surprised when he appeared beside her, looking slightly disheveled but calmer than he had been the previous day. "Morning," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Morning." She took a sip of her tea, waiting for him to speak. He sat down on the bench opposite her, rubbing the back of his neck. "I ended things with Delilah." Evelyn raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting the weight of his words hang between them. "I'm not expecting you to forgive me," he continued, "but I'm starting to realize just how much damage I've done, and I'm willing to fix it, if you'll let me." Evelyn set her cup down and looked him directly in the eye. "Ethan, fixing this isn't about asking for permission. It's about showing me that you can." He nodded, understanding the challenge in her words. This wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to try. The setting sun bathed the Callaway mansion in a deep amber hue, casting long shadows over the marble floors and intricate decor that had once been a symbol of success and pride. But tonight, the sprawling mansion felt less like a home and more like the scene of an inevitable confrontation. Evelyn stood in front of the fireplace in the grand living room, her arms loosely folded across her chest as she watched the flames flicker. The warmth barely registered, her mind preoccupied with the storm brewing within her. She had heard Ethan come in nearly 20 minutes ago. The door had clicked shut, his footsteps had echoed down the hallway, and then silence. But she knew him well enough to recognize the quiet as a sign of deliberation. He was gathering his thoughts, preparing himself for what he probably assumed would be an argument he could control. Evelyn sighed and poured herself a glass of red wine, the sound of the liquid filling the glass oddly soothing. She took a small sip just as Ethan's figure appeared in the doorway. His silhouette was sharp against the dim light, but the tension in his posture was impossible to miss. "Are you waiting for me?" he asked, stepping inside. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Evelyn turned to face him, her expression neutral. "I figured you'd want to talk eventually." He loosened his tie and tossed it onto a nearby chair before walking over to the bar cart to pour himself a drink. The clinking of glass against glass filled the room like an unwelcome interruption. "I'm not sure where to start," he admitted after taking a long sip of bourbon. "Start wherever you like," Evelyn replied. "I'm curious to hear what you have to say." Ethan paced near the window, his hand gripping the glass tightly. For a moment, it seemed like he was debating whether to lash out or approach the conversation with caution. He chose the latter, but not without bitterness. "You've made your point, Evelyn. You've shown me that you're more than capable of grabbing attention and turning the tide. Congratulations." Her lips curved into a small, humorless smile. "This isn't about grabbing attention, Ethan. It's about reclaiming my place in a life I helped build but was pushed out of." Ethan exhaled sharply and set his drink down on the windowsill. "Is that how you see it? That I pushed you out?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "You stopped seeing me. You stopped caring about what I wanted, what I needed. I was just the woman who smiled at your business dinners and looked good in photographs." He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. "And what about you, Evelyn? Did you ever think about how much pressure I was under? The deals, the deadlines, the clients who expected everything from me?" "Yes," she said again, her voice steady but firm. "I thought about it every day, and I supported you. But when did that become a reason to ignore me completely? When did that become a justification for inviting another woman into our life?" Ethan flinched as if her words had physically struck him. For a moment, the weight of his choices pressed down on him so heavily that he couldn't meet her gaze. But then, like a man clinging to the last shred of his pride, he pushed back. "I made mistakes," he admitted, his tone softer but still defensive. "But I never thought you'd humiliate me in front of everyone like that." Evelyn took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "Humiliate you? You think my donation humiliated you? Ethan, you humiliated yourself the moment you walked into that gala with her on your arm." His shoulders sagged, and for the first time in the conversation, he seemed genuinely vulnerable. "So, what happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn took a deep breath. "That depends on you." The silence that followed was deafening, but Evelyn refused to fill it. She had spent years cushioning Ethan's ego, offering reassurances and compromises that left her drained. But not tonight. Tonight, he would have to sit with the discomfort of facing the damage he'd caused. Ethan walked back to the bar and refilled his glass, his movements slower now, as if the weight of the conversation had begun to take its toll. "I ended things with Delilah," he said quietly. Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "And I'm supposed to be grateful for that?" "No," he admitted. "But it's a start." She nodded slowly, processing his words. "Why did you end it?" "Because it wasn't real," he confessed. "She was a distraction, an escape from everything. But it didn't mean anything." Evelyn crossed her arms again, her eyes searching his face for any sign of sincerity. "What exactly were you escaping from, Ethan? Me? Our life?" Ethan sighed and leaned against the bar, his gaze falling to the floor. "Maybe. Or maybe I was escaping from the version of myself that I didn't want to face. The man who had everything and still wasn't satisfied." His admission surprised her, but she didn't let it show. "And have you figured out why you weren't satisfied?" He looked up, meeting her eyes with a vulnerability she hadn't seen in years. "Because I forgot what mattered." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Evelyn allowed herself to feel the impact of them. But words, she reminded herself, were easy. Actions were what mattered now. She walked over to the couch and sat down, gesturing for him to join her. Reluctantly, he did. The space between them felt like a chasm, but at least they were facing it together. "Ethan," she began, her voice softer now, "I don't need grand apologies or promises that things will be different overnight. What I need is for you to understand that I won't settle for being an afterthought anymore. If you want to rebuild this marriage, you'll have to show me that you're capable of change." He nodded, his expression solemn. "I understand. Do you?" she asked, her tone laced with both hope and skepticism. "Because if you're just saying what you think I want to hear, then we're wasting our time." "I'm not," he replied, his voice steady. "I know I failed you, Evelyn, but I want to make it right." She studied him for a long moment, searching for any cracks in his resolve. When she found none, she nodded. "Then show me." As the evening wore on, they sat in silence, the only sound coming from the crackling fire. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel like a wall between them. It felt like the beginning of something new. Whether that something would lead to reconciliation or closure, Evelyn wasn't sure. But at least now, the truth was out in the open, and the next move was entirely in Ethan's hands. Before he left the room, he turned to her one last time. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" she asked, genuinely curious. "For not giving up on me," he replied, his gaze filled with both gratitude and regret. Evelyn didn't answer right away. Instead, she took another sip of her wine and watched him disappear down the hallway. She wanted to believe in his sincerity, but only time would tell if his words would lead to lasting change. As she sat there, watching the dying embers of the fire, Evelyn felt a strange mix of hope and caution. The road ahead would be long, but at least it had begun. The ticking of the clock echoed in the vast silence of Ethan Calloway's home office. The sleek leather chair beneath him creaked as he leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if the answers to his problems were written in the delicate cracks of the plaster. But there were no answers, only the dull throb of his own regret and confusion. The events of the past few days had been a whirlwind, and for the first time in years, he was starting to feel like he didn't have control over anything. Delilah's number was still saved in his phone under a name that once made him smile, Red Flame. But now, as he stared at the glowing screen, her name no longer evoked excitement or thrill. It was just another reminder of a choice he wished he hadn't made. He hadn't spoken to her since the night he ended things, and part of him wondered if she was relieved or furious. Either way, it didn't matter. He tossed the phone onto the desk, rubbing his temples as if he could massage the guilt away. But the guilt had long since settled into his bones. Across town, Delilah wasn't doing much better. She paced the floor of her luxury apartment, her heels clicking against the polished wood. The walls, decorated with framed photographs of exotic vacations and fashion shoots, seemed to mock her. She had spent months crafting the perfect role in Ethan's life, only to be discarded when things got complicated. Her phone buzzed, and she snatched it up, half hoping it was Ethan calling to apologize. But it wasn't him. It was a message from one of her close friends. "You were right. Everyone's talking about Evelyn. She's the new darling of the charity scene." Delilah clenched her jaw and deleted the message without replying. She knew exactly what it meant. Evelyn had not only reclaimed her place in Ethan's life, but had also become a public figure people respected. And no one respected the mistress. Fuming, Delilah poured herself a glass of wine and collapsed onto the couch. "He's going to regret this," she whispered to herself, though the words rang hollow. Back at the Calloway mansion, Evelyn was on the phone with one of the board members of the Children's Education Initiative, finalizing plans for the next phase of the project. The glow of satisfaction lit her features, but she remained composed, knowing that triumphs like these needed to be handled with grace. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she said warmly. "I'll see you at the meeting next week." As she ended the call, she turned to find Ethan standing in the doorway, watching her. He had been doing that more often lately, hovering just beyond her reach, as if he didn't know whether he was welcome or intruding. "Busy day?" he asked, stepping inside. "Productive," she replied, leaning back in her chair. "What about you?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "I met with a few clients this morning, but honestly, I've been thinking about us more than work." Evelyn studied him, her gaze softening just slightly. "And what have you figured out?" "That I've spent too much time trying to fix problems with money and too little time fixing myself," he admitted. The honesty in his voice surprised her, but she didn't let it show. "I appreciate the introspection, Ethan, but words won't change anything." "I know," he said quickly, "and I'm not asking for forgiveness overnight. I just want you to know that I'm trying." She nodded, acknowledging his effort without fully committing to trusting it. Good. That evening, the collapse of Ethan's once carefully curated life continued to unfold in ways he couldn't have anticipated. At the office, rumors had begun to swirl about his personal life, and while no one dared confront him directly, the whispers were impossible to ignore. Meetings felt colder, conversations were shorter, and even the way his assistants interacted with him had changed. They used to hang on his every word, eager to please. Now, they were distant, as if they sensed that his power wasn't as unshakable as it once seemed. The worst blow came when he received a call from one of his oldest business associates. "Ethan," the voice on the other end said, cautious but firm, "we've decided to move forward without you on this project." Ethan sat up straighter, gripping the phone tighter. "What do you mean? We've been partners for years." "I know, but the board has concerns. With everything going on in your personal life, it's just not good optics." His heart sank. "You're cutting me out because of optics?" "Don't take it personally," the man replied. "It's just business." Ethan ended the call without responding. For the first time in his career, he felt powerless, as though the walls of his empire were closing in on him. He stared at his reflection in the window, the man looking back at him a far cry from the confident, untouchable executive he had been just a few months ago. Later that night, Evelyn found him sitting on the couch in the dark, a bottle of whiskey on the coffee table and an empty glass in his hand. The sight of him like this, defeated, vulnerable, stirred something in her, but she wasn't sure if it was sympathy or something deeper. "Rough day?" she asked, breaking the silence. He looked up at her, his eyes heavy with fatigue. "You could say that." She hesitated for a moment before sitting down across from him. "You're not used to losing, are you?" He let out a bitter laugh. "Not like this. I thought I could manage everything. Work, you, Delilah. But now, it's all slipping away." Evelyn leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Maybe that's the problem, Ethan. You've spent so much time trying to manage people that you forgot how to connect with them." He didn't respond right away, swirling the remaining drops of whiskey in his glass as if searching for answers. "Do you think it's too late?" She considered his question carefully. "It's not too late to change, but it is too late to pretend that everything can go back to the way it was." He nodded, accepting her words even though they stung. "I'm willing to do the work," he said quietly. I just need to know if it's worth it. Evelyn stood and walked toward the door, pausing briefly before turning back to face him. That's not a question I can answer for you, Ethan. You have to decide if it's worth it for yourself. As she left the room, Ethan leaned back against the couch, her words replaying in his mind. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, but for the first time, he realized that the collapse of his life wasn't the end. It could be the beginning of something new. If only he had the courage to face it. The rain tapped gently against the large glass windows of the Calloway mansion, its rhythmic patter filling the quiet space of the living room. Outside, the garden was drenched in silver droplets, the leaves of the rose bushes bending under the weight of the rain. Inside, Evelyn sat on the plush cream-colored couch, a warm blanket draped over her legs and a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. The soft glow of the table lamp cast a serene light on her face, but her mind was far from calm. The last few weeks had been a storm of emotions. Ethan's attempts to repair their relationship had been consistent but restrained, as if he were walking a tightrope, afraid that one wrong move would send him spiraling into the void. She had watched him quietly, noting the subtle changes, the way he listened more, the way he stepped back to give her space instead of demanding answers. But the distance between them still loomed large, an invisible chasm neither of them could fully cross. Evelyn exhaled and set the cup down on the table. She wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. Forgiveness? Closure? Both? The truth was, she wasn't even sure if she had the strength to decide. She had spent so much time being patient, hoping that one day Ethan would realize what he was throwing away. And now that he finally seemed to understand, she wasn't sure if it was enough. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She glanced toward it, her brows furrowing in confusion. It was late, and the staff had already retired for the evening. Rising from the couch, she wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and walked to the door. When she opened it, she found Ethan standing there, his hair damp from the rain and his suit clinging to his body. "You're soaking wet," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "What were you thinking, coming here like this?" "I needed to see you," he replied, brushing rainwater off his sleeves. "I didn't want to wait until morning." Evelyn led him to the kitchen, where she handed him a towel and put on a pot of tea. The kitchen, usually bright and bustling during the day, felt cozy and intimate under the dim light of the overhead lamp. Ethan dried his hair and sat at the island, watching her move around the room with practiced ease. For a moment, he was reminded of the early days of their marriage when they used to stay up late talking over cups of tea, dreaming about the future they would build together. But those nights felt like a distant memory now. When Evelyn placed a cup of tea in front of him, he wrapped his hands around it, savoring the warmth. "I didn't mean to barge in like this." "You didn't," she said softly, sitting across from him. "But it's late. What's on your mind?" He stared into the cup, as if the swirling steam could offer him the words he struggled to find. "I'm afraid," he admitted finally. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, surprised by his candor. "Afraid of what?" "Of losing you," he said, meeting her gaze. "And of losing the version of myself that you once loved." Her throat tightened, and she looked away, focusing on the flickering candle in the center of the table. "I won't lie to you, Ethan. I don't know if I can go back to who I was before. And I'm not sure I want to." He nodded, his fingers tightening around the cup. "I don't expect you to. I know I've put you through more than you deserve. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to rebuild something real between us." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her arms crossing over her chest. "Why now, Ethan? Why did it take losing almost everything for you to realize what was in front of you all along?" He swallowed hard, struggling to form an answer. "Because I was selfish. I thought success would fill the emptiness, but the more I chased it, the more I lost sight of what truly mattered. I thought I could have it all, my career, my freedom, and you waiting at home. But I was wrong." Silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock. Evelyn traced her finger along the edge of her cup, her mind racing. She wanted to believe him, to trust that his words weren't just another attempt to patch things up temporarily. But the scars he had left weren't easily healed. "I can't promise you forgiveness," she said finally. "I can't promise that things will go back to the way they were, "I'm not asking for that," Ethan replied. "I'm asking for the chance to prove that I'm different." The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the garden glistening with droplets that clung to the leaves like tiny crystals. Evelyn stood by the window, sipping her morning coffee as she watched the world wake up. Birds chirped softly, and the distant hum of traffic reminded her that life outside their mansion continued, unaffected by the chaos within. Ethan entered the room, freshly showered and dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks. The tension from the night before still hung in the air, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, an air of determination that hadn't been there before. "I thought you'd be sleeping in," Evelyn said, her gaze still fixed on the garden. "I couldn't," he replied, walking over to the coffee pot. "Too much on my mind." She turned to face him, leaning against the counter. "What's your plan, Ethan? You say you want to fix things, but what does that look like to you?" He took a sip of his coffee and set the cup down. "It looks like me being present, not just physically, but emotionally. I've already started distancing myself from unnecessary business commitments. I've scheduled meetings with the families I've wronged to personally apologize and offer reparations." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "You're really meeting with them?" "Yes," he said firmly. "And I know it won't fix everything, but it's a start." Her chest tightened with a mix of emotions: pride, hope, and fear. She wanted to believe that this version of Ethan was real, that he wasn't just saying what she wanted to hear. But the walls she had built around her heart were strong, and it would take more than promises to tear them down. "I need time," she said quietly. "I understand," he replied. "Take all the time you need." As he turned to leave the room, Evelyn's voice stopped him. "Ethan?" He paused, looking over his shoulder. "Yes?" "I'm glad you're trying," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But don't do this just for me. Do it because you want to be better." He nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy cloak. "I will." As he left the room, Evelyn sat back down at the table, her fingers wrapping around her cup. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the faint stirrings of something she thought she had lost: hope. Evelyn stood at the entrance of the charity center, the large glass doors reflecting her image back at her. The morning sun spilled over the city, casting warm golden hues across the sidewalks as people hurried past, unaware of the personal journey unfolding within her. Clutching the handle of her leather bag, she took a deep breath before stepping inside, the familiar hum of activity instantly grounding her. Volunteers bustled about, organizing materials for the day's workshops, while children's laughter echoed faintly from a classroom down the hall. The place felt alive with purpose, a sanctuary for growth and healing. Evelyn had poured her heart into this project long before last night's conversation with Ethan, but today, the work felt heavier, as though the weight of her personal life had seeped into her professional world. "Mrs. Calloway," the voice of Mr. Edwards, the head of the charity foundation, called out as he approached her with a warm smile. "I was hoping you'd stop by this morning. We have some new donors I'd love for you to meet." Evelyn smiled politely, but her heart wasn't fully in it. "Of course," she replied. "Let's make sure they feel welcome." They walked down the corridor, passing by murals painted by the children in the program. Bright colors, whimsical shapes, and hopeful messages covered the walls, a reminder of why she had dedicated herself to this cause in the first place. But as much as she tried to focus on the work ahead, her mind kept drifting back to Ethan. She had seen the change in him, or at least the beginning of it. His decision to meet with the families whose businesses he had harmed, to take responsibility for his past actions. It wasn't the kind of gesture Ethan Calloway of 6 months ago would have made. But was it enough? Could she trust that this version of him was permanent? By midday, Evelyn found herself in the organization's conference room, meeting with potential donors and board members. The meeting was productive, filled with discussions of expansion plans and scholarship programs, but Evelyn couldn't shake the nagging feeling of uncertainty that clung to her like a shadow. As the meeting ended, she gathered her notes and made her way to the exit, her thoughts swirling like a storm. Just as she reached the front doors, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw Ethan's name. Her thumb hovered over the answer button for a moment before she finally pressed it. "Hi," she said, her voice cautious. "Hey," Ethan replied. There was a slight pause before he continued. Are you free for lunch? I'd like to talk. Evelyn hesitated. I don't know if… Please, he interrupted, his tone earnest. Just lunch. No pressure. She sighed softly. Okay. Where? Half an hour later, Evelyn found herself seated at a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street. Unlike the upscale restaurants they used to frequent, this place was humble, with mismatched wooden tables and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. It reminded her of the early days of their relationship when they would spend hours in little cafes, talking about their dreams and ambitions before the weight of life took over. Ethan arrived just as the waitress placed a cup of tea in front of Evelyn. He looked more casual than usual. His tie was gone, and his sleeves were rolled up, revealing the faint tan line of his expensive watch. He offered her a small, nervous smile as he sat down. Thanks for coming, he said, folding his hands on the table. I wasn't sure I would, she admitted, stirring her tea. But here we are. Ethan nodded, his fingers tapping lightly against the wooden surface as if he were rehearsing his words. I know you've heard me apologize before, and I know it doesn't mean much without actions to back it up, but I wanted to share something with you. He pulled out a small leather-bound notebook and placed it between them. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, curious but cautious. What is this? She asked, opening the notebook to the first page. It's a journal, he explained. I started it after our conversation a few weeks ago. I've been writing down everything. My meetings with the families I wronged, my reflections on how I got here, and most importantly, the ways I'm trying to change. Evelyn flipped through the pages, her fingers grazing over the handwritten notes. Some pages were filled with meeting summaries, others with personal reflections that made her heart ache. I sat across from Mr. Palmer today, the man whose business I destroyed without a second thought. He didn't yell or accuse me. He just asked me one question. How did you sleep at night knowing you took everything from me? I didn't have an answer. I'm not sure I ever will. Evelyn deserves better. I knew that the day I married her, but somewhere along the way, I forgot. Now, I'm trying to remember. I just hope it's not too late. She closed the journal, her fingers trembling slightly. You've been writing all of this? Every day, Ethan replied. It helps me stay accountable. It's not just about proving it to you. It's about proving it to myself. Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. She had waited so long for Ethan to see the damage he had caused, not just to her but to himself. And now, sitting across from him, she saw a man who was finally confronting the demons he had spent years ignoring. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to say anything, Ethan replied. Just know that I'm committed to this, whether or not you decide to give me another chance. The sincerity in his eyes made her chest tighten. She wasn't ready to fully forgive him, but for the first time, she saw a version of him that she could believe in. As they left the cafe, the cool afternoon breeze wrapped around them, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. They walked side by side down the quiet street, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. Where do we go from here? Evelyn asked, her gaze focused on the cobblestones beneath her feet. Ethan hesitated, then stopped walking. Evelyn turned to face him, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her breath hitch. I don't know, he admitted, but I'm willing to find out, one step at a time. Evelyn searched his face, looking for any trace of the man who had hurt her. But all she saw was someone who was trying, someone who was broken but willing to rebuild. She took a deep breath and nodded. One step at a time, she echoed. They continued walking, the path ahead uncertain but shared. For the first time in months, Evelyn felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. The road to forgiveness wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, it was worth traveling. The first rays of morning light slipped through the sheer curtains of the Calloway mansion, casting a soft glow across the bedroom where Evelyn sat by the window, her fingers tracing the edge of a book she had barely opened. Outside, the garden was alive with the sounds of chirping birds and the distant hum of traffic, but inside, the air was heavy with contemplation. Her meeting with Ethan at the cafe the day before had stirred something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But it was a fragile kind of hope, like a flickering candle that could be snuffed out by the slightest breeze. She closed the book and leaned back against the plush chair, her mind drifting to the man who had once been her closest companion and how far they had drifted from each other. A knock on the door broke her reverie. It was soft, tentative, as though the person on the other side wasn't sure they would be welcome. "Come in," she called, her voice calm but measured. Ethan stepped inside, dressed in a light sweater and jeans, a departure from his usual business attire. He looked less like the polished CEO and more like the man she had fallen in love with years ago. The man who used to make her laugh during rainy afternoons and dance with her in their kitchen for no reason at all. "Good morning," he said, offering her a small smile. "Morning," she replied, closing the book and setting it aside. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Too much on my mind." Evelyn nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Join me." He hesitated for a moment before sitting down. The space between them wasn't as vast as it had been in recent weeks, but it still carried the weight of unspoken fears and unresolved questions. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Ethan began, his gaze meeting hers. "About not doing this just for you, but for myself." "And?" she prompted, leaning forward slightly. "And you're right," he said. "For years, I measured my success by how much money I made, how many deals I closed, and how many people I could impress. But none of that ever made me happy. It just distracted me from facing the fact that I was losing the things that actually mattered." Evelyn studied him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was a man who looked tired. Tired of running, tired of pretending, and ready to face the consequences of his choices. "I'm not asking for forgiveness today," he continued. "I know that's something I have to earn over time. But I want you to know that I'm committed to making things right." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and let his words sink in. "It's going to take more than words, Ethan," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "That's why I've been working on something." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stack of papers, neatly folded and slightly creased at the edges. He handed them to her, watching her expression as she unfolded them and began to read. The documents detailed a series of initiatives he had started: donations to the families he had wronged, mentorship programs for struggling entrepreneurs, and a significant portion of his company's profits being redirected to community projects. "I've already begun meeting with some of the families," he explained, "not just to offer financial compensation, but to apologize. To listen. Some of them accepted it, and some didn't. But I'm not giving up." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the papers as she read his handwritten notes detailing the emotional conversations he had had with the people he had harmed. One line in particular caught her eye. "Apologies won't erase the past, but they can be the foundation for a better future." She looked up at him, her throat tightening. "You're really doing this?" "I am," he said firmly. "Because I want to be someone you can trust again. But more importantly, I want to be someone I can trust." Evelyn set the papers aside and took a deep breath. The vulnerability in his voice, the weight of his actions, it was all too much to ignore. She had spent so long waiting for him to see beyond his own ambitions, and now that he finally had, she wasn't sure how to process it. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you have to understand that this doesn't erase the pain." "I know," he replied, "but I'm willing to take it one day at a time. No shortcuts, no easy fixes." She nodded, the knot in her chest loosening ever so slightly. "Then let's see where this takes us." The days that followed were a mix of progress and caution. Ethan dedicated himself to the initiatives he had outlined, spending long hours meeting with community leaders, attending charity events, and working with the families he had once harmed. But unlike before, his work wasn't about public recognition or praise. It was about making genuine amends. Evelyn watched from a distance, observing how he navigated this new path. She noticed the way he carried himself differently, not with the arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him success, but with the humility of someone who knew he had to earn every ounce of respect. It was a side of Ethan she hadn't seen in years, and it stirred something inside her that she hadn't expected: admiration. One evening, As they sat on the back patio overlooking the garden, Ethan handed her a cup of tea and sat beside her. The scent of jasmine wafted through the air, mingling with the cool night breeze. "How was your day?" she asked, taking a sip of her tea. "Busy," he replied, stretching his legs out in front of him. "I met with Mr. Palmer again. He was less hostile this time." Evelyn smiled softly. "That's progress." "It is," Ethan agreed, turning to face her. "But the biggest progress I've made is realizing that this isn't just about fixing what I broke. It's about building something better." She placed her cup on the table and looked at him, her gaze searching his for any sign of the man he used to be. But all she saw was someone who had grown, someone who had learned from his mistakes and was willing to keep learning. "Do you think we can build something better too?" he asked, his voice filled with both hope and uncertainty. Evelyn didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. The warmth of his touch felt familiar, but different, like the first step towards something new. "I think we can try," she said finally, "but it's going to take time." "I'm okay with that," Ethan replied. "As long as we're moving forward together." They sat in comfortable silence, the night wrapping around them like a protective cocoon. For the first time in months, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, redemption wasn't an impossible dream. It was a journey they could take together, one step at a time. The crisp morning air carried the scent of blooming magnolias as Evelyn sat on the garden bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The sky above was a soft shade of blue, and the dew on the grass sparkled like tiny diamonds in the sunlight. But despite the serene beauty of her surroundings, Evelyn's thoughts were anything but calm. She had come here for clarity, a quiet place to think about what the future held for her and Ethan. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of change, positive change, but change nonetheless. For someone who had spent years drowning in routine and neglect, the sudden shift was both exhilarating and terrifying. The sound of the gate creaking open caught her attention, and she turned to see a courier walking toward her, a crisp envelope in his hand. "Mrs. Calloway?" the man asked, offering her the letter. "Yes," she replied, taking it from him with a polite nod. The envelope was unmarked except for her name, written in neat cursive across the front. She turned it over, feeling the weight of the paper as if it carried more than just ink. Slowly, she broke the seal and pulled out a letter, the handwriting immediately familiar. "Ethan." Her heart quickened as she began to read. "Dear Evelyn, by the time you read this, you'll probably be sitting in the garden, just like you always do when you need to think. I know this place brings you peace, and I hope that as you read these words, you'll find a little more of it. I don't know if I can ever fully make up for the hurt I caused you. I don't expect you to forget it, and I don't expect forgiveness to be easy. But what I do expect, what I promise, is that I will never take you or our life for granted again. When I started this journey to fix what I had broken, I thought the goal was to win you back. But now, I realize it was about something bigger. It was about becoming the kind of man who could deserve you in the first place. I've learned that redemption isn't about undoing the past. It's about learning from it, growing, and showing the people you love that they matter more than anything else. And you, Evelyn, have always mattered the most. Today, I made a decision. I've signed over part of my company's shares to the education fund. This isn't just a donation, it's a commitment. I want to be part of something that gives back, that builds rather than takes. And I want you to know that your vision for this charity isn't just yours anymore. It's ours. I hope this letter doesn't feel like a final plea or a desperate attempt to win you over. It's not. It's simply a promise, one that I intend to keep. Thank you for giving me the space to change. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to. And thank you for being the woman who reminded me that love isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn. If you're ready, I'd love to meet you where it all began. The cafe where we had our first date. I'll be there today at noon. But if you're not ready, I understand. I won't push. Take all the time you need. Love. Ethan. Evelyn's hands trembled as she lowered the letter onto her lap. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she tried to process the flood of emotions that washed over her. Grief for what they had lost, hope for what they could rebuild, and pride in the man Ethan had become. She wiped a tear from her cheek and stood, clutching the letter tightly. The cafe wasn't far from their home, and the short drive there felt like an eternity. As she parked the car and stepped out onto the cobblestone street, memories of their first date came rushing back. The nervous energy, the shared laughter, the way Ethan had held her hand as they talked about their dreams. It all felt so distant, yet so vividly present. She entered the cafe, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the warm aroma of pastries. Her eyes scanned the room, and there he was, Ethan, sitting at a corner table by the window, just like he had all those years ago. He looked up as she approached, a mixture of relief and nervousness flickering across his face. He stood, smoothing his hands over his shirt as if trying to steady himself. "You came," he said softly. Evelyn nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She slid into the seat across from him, her hands still clutching the letter. "I wasn't sure if you would," he admitted, his gaze searching hers. "I wasn't sure either," she whispered. "But I read your letter, and I realized that the man who wrote it isn't the same man I've been angry at. He's someone new, someone I want to get to know again." Ethan's shoulders relaxed, and he exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I don't want to rush you, Evelyn. I know this won't be easy." "No, it won't," she agreed. "But nothing worth having ever is." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the hum of conversation and the clinking of cups filling the space around them. Ethan reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through. "I miss this," he said quietly. "Me too," Evelyn replied, squeezing his hand gently. They spent the next hour talking, about the charity, about their dreams, and about the version of themselves they had lost along the way. For the first time in a long while, there were no accusations or defenses, just honesty and vulnerability. As they left the cafe, the sun peeked through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the street. Ethan walked beside her, their fingers intertwined. It wasn't the perfect ending, but it was a new beginning, and that was enough. When they reached her car, Evelyn turned to him, her eyes filled with both love and caution. "This doesn't mean everything is fixed," she said, "but it does mean I'm willing to try. That's all I need," Ethan replied. "One day at a time." She leaned in and kissed him softly, the taste of coffee and promise lingering between them. As she pulled away, she handed him back the letter. "Hold on to this. I want you to remember what you wrote when things get hard." "I will," he promised, tucking it into his jacket pocket. As they drove off in separate cars, Evelyn felt a lightness she hadn't felt in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she believed that they could navigate it together. Because love, she realized, wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience.